Sold. That was chalked above a bound woman's head outside the trading post, the morning that would change everything. No warrant on that wagon. Nothing lawful about the rope at her wrists. Only a man named Barrett Sloan, counting on nobody looking twice. Jonah Reed had ridden into that dusty stretch of Arizona territory for flour, coffee, and a plug of tobacco. Nothing grander than that. He left his horse loose-reined at the rail the moment he saw the wagon and the woman kneeling in its bed, wrists lashed with rope gone dark at the edges from wear, her back straight as a rifle barrel, her chin lifted like she had decided long ago that no one would ever see her flinch. She did not look like a woman who had done anything wrong. She looked like a woman unlucky enough to be beautiful and alone on a road where a man like Sloan made his living. He was maybe 30, sun-cured the color of saddle leather, carrying a particular quiet that made some men uneasy because they could not read what sat behind it. Years back, he had worn a cavalry uniform and traded it since for a drifter's bedroll and a horse he was still paying off in trail work, one ranch at a time. In his own mind, he had simply outgrown army life and moved on from it, plain and simple. That was not entirely a lie. It also was not entirely the truth, and the gap between those two things was a debt he had been quietly carrying for longer than he liked to own up to, even to himself, in the privacy of his own thinking. Cottonwood Crossing was the kind of trading post that existed mostly because the road happened to bend there. A low adobe store, a corral, a well, and a scatter of travelers passing through on their way to somewhere more permanent. On an ordinary morning, it sold flour and coffee and gossip in roughly equal measure, and nobody expected anything more dramatic than a haggle over the price of tobacco. Two men rested their horses at the rail that particular morning. A freighter waiting on a delayed shipment leaned against a post, whittling nothing in particular, and the storekeeper stood in his own doorway with the specific, weary patience of a man who had watched every kind of traveler pass through his yard and had long ago stopped being surprised by most of them. He would remember this morning differently than the rest. Sloan stood near the tailgate, letting anyone nearby hear that this woman had stolen horses down near the Gila and that he was hauling her to the marshal in the next county. A fine public service, in his own words, one that deserved a little gratitude and maybe a drink bought in his honor. Nobody at the trading post pressed to see the paper that would have made any of that true, because nobody wanted trouble with a man who traveled armed and unaccompanied by any law. Jonah pressed anyway. Sloan waved the question off the easy way a man waves off something he has learned other men will not push on. Jonah did not push again with words. He filled a tin cup at the horse trough, carried it to the wagon step, and backed off 3 full paces before she reached for it. She would not drink with a stranger standing close enough to touch. Only when the distance between them was wide enough to matter did she lift the cup to her mouth, and even then her eyes never left Sloan. Not once, not for a heartbeat. The missing paperwork had already made its point. This only confirmed it. A lawful prisoner does not fear the law. She fears exactly one man, and it is always the man holding the rope. It turned out Sloan owed the storekeeper $28 on a running account he had been dodging for a month, a debt the storekeeper mentioned mostly to grumble, never expecting a stranger to settle it. Jonah settled it. He counted out nearly every dollar of his winter wages, folded flat inside his coat, right there on the store counter, in front of the storekeeper and 2 travelers resting their horses at the rail, loud enough that all 3 would remember it, word for word. That's your debt, not hers. Greed won a short argument against suspicion on Sloan's face, and he pocketed the money fast, the way a man pockets money he knows he has not fully earned. Then Jonah walked to the wagon, drew the pocket knife from his belt, and watched her flinch at the sight of the blade, the way a person flinches who has learned that blades near them rarely mean good news. He turned the handle toward her before anything else, held it out hilt first, let her see plainly that he meant to cut something and not someone, and only then reached past her bound wrists and cut the rope. Just the rope, nothing else. You're free to go. He stepped back off the wagon like a man finishing an errand, already thinking about the trail west and a ranch 3 days out where he was due for spring branding. He never asked her name. He never waited to be thanked. He mounted up, touched his hat brim toward the storekeeper, and rode west out of the trading post, fully certain he would never lay eyes on that woman again as long as he lived. He was wrong about that within the hour. A mile out of town, on a stretch of road with nothing on it but heat and dust and the long violet shadow of the mountains ahead, Jonah looked back, some instinct a man does not examine too closely, and found her there, walking, not running, not calling, not waving him down for a ride, just walking the same road he was riding, a good quarter-mile behind, matching his pace as though she had already decided that was simply where she was going to. He slowed his horse. She slowed her steps to match, keeping the same quarter-mile of open dust between them, and something in the set of her shoulders made plain that closing that distance was not an invitation he had been given. He did not know yet that in her world, a gift handed over by a stranger was never simply a gift. It was the first thread of a rope nobody admits they are tying. She had watched enough men perform enough kindness to know that gratitude, once accepted, has a way of curdling into obligation, and obligation has a way of curdling into ownership all over again. She would take nothing from him that she had not somehow balanced first, on her own terms, in her own time. He did not know any of that yet. He only knew a freed woman was following a stranger down an empty road instead of turning toward wherever home was, and that fact alone made plain her road home was not one she could safely walk by herself. That evening he built his fire at a respectful distance from where she had stopped for the night, and left a canteen of water balanced on a flat rock roughly halfway between his camp and wherever she had settled into the mesquite. He did not watch her take it. At first light he went to check, and the canteen sat exactly where he had left it, water gone, the cap turned to seal it tight, set down with a precision that felt almost like a message. I owe you nothing extra for this. The next evening he left a plate of beans the same way, halfway between the two camps, and in the morning found the plate rinsed clean with sand and returned to that same flat rock, not a grain of it out of place. Guess that makes us even, he thought aloud, mostly to himself, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he was grinning when he said it. He held the spare horse out to her on the third day. She refused it with a single shake of her head, definite as a closed door, and kept walking. It was only on the fourth night, when he laid a second blanket at the usual distance, and then, instead of walking off, simply sat down at his own fire and waited, that she came and took it, not before he sat, only after, as though the order of it mattered more than the blanket itself. It did matter. A gift taken from a man's open, waiting hand is a transaction. A gift taken while his back is half turned, while he is occupied with his own fire and expecting nothing in return, is closer to a kindness a person can accept without owing the giver a single thing. He was learning her rules without her ever once explaining a single one of them out loud, the way you learn the shape of a canyon by walking it in the dark. The country they crossed those first days gave neither of them much shade to hide their study of each other in. Long stretches of caliche flat, broken by dry washes and stands of ocotillo, standing like burned fence posts against a sky gone white with heat by mid-morning. She walked it without complaint, without slowing, in a pair of worn moccasins that had clearly carried her over harder ground than this before, and Jonah found himself, more than once, matching his horse's pace to hers instead of the other way around, though he never once let her see him do it on purpose. He never asked her name. It would have been the easiest question in the world, and he denied himself the wanting of it for 3 straight days, because somewhere in 8 years of army life, he had learned a hard truth about people freshly cut loose from captivity. A question can become another kind of rope. A name given under obligation is a name given to a stranger who still, in some small way, holds power over the giving of it. He would rather ride beside her for 100 silent miles than have her feel she owed him her name the way she had once owed a debt she never actually contracted. For her part, she had spent those same silent miles doing her own kind of arithmetic, watching him the way a person watches weather before deciding whether to trust a clear sky. A man's kindness meant little to her on its own. She had seen kindness used as a leash more times than she cared to count, offered sweet at first, and tightened only once a person had grown too grateful to pull away. What she watched for instead was consistency, whether the gentleness held up on the third day the same as the first, whether it changed at all once no one but the desert was watching him do it. By the fourth day, it had not changed once, and that told her more than any single kind act could have. She gave it to him herself, in the end, in the middle of the night, when he least expected to hear her voice at all. He woke near midnight to an empty camp and a jolt of pure fear that she had simply vanished back into the desert without him ever knowing whether she had made it anywhere safe. Then a voice came out of the dark behind him, low and even, closer than he had figured. 3 riders, coming from the east, slow, like men who don't want to be heard before they want to be seen. She had climbed the low rise above the camp to see farther across the flat than the firelight allowed, and she had counted them long before he had so much as stirred. In the dark, with nothing but starlight to go on, she gave him her name for the first time, Chenoa, and then, in the same breath, the name that mattered more right now, Sloane comes. A single name carried more warning than a shouted alarm ever could have, out there in that much open dark. If a story like this is the kind you come back for, become a channel member and tap Join beside the channel name. It helps keep these stories coming. Dawn brought Sloane and 2 hired men riding in at an easy pace that was meant to look casual and did not fool anyone. I came for what belongs with me. Sloane's voice carried 30 yards off, rehearsed and pleased with itself. Jonah stood between him and the low fire, unhurried, his own voice carrying easy across the flat morning air. People do not belong to you. Sloane tried the horse thief story again, louder this time, playing to his own hired men more than to Jonah. And then, without meaning to, he overplayed his hand. He mentioned, almost as a threat, that the woman's family carried real influence among their people, that there would be a reward worth more than horses if he brought her back instead of losing her for nothing. It was meant to sound like leverage. It landed instead as a confession. A man does not need a bounty on a lawful prisoner. Bounties are for property somebody wants returned, and property does not require a warrant it never had in the first place. Jonah let the silence sit a moment before he answered. He put a name to the storekeeper. He put a name to the 2 travelers who had stood at that counter and watched $28 change hands and heard your debt, not hers, spoken plain in front of witnesses. He put forward, calm as Sunday, riding the whole party back to that trading post right now, letting every one of those witnesses swear to exactly what they had seen: the ropes, the missing paper, the price Sloane had put on a human being like she was a horse worth counting. Sloane's 2 hired men had gone quiet well before their employer did, the particular quiet of men who had signed on for easy wages, and were only now doing the arithmetic on what a charge of holding a free woman without lawful cause might cost them personally if it ever reached a circuit judge. Neither one moved a hand toward a holster. Neither one, it was plain to see, much wanted to be standing in that yard at all anymore. Sloane's confidence went thin fast after that. He backed his horse a step, tried one more line about how her own people would never thank Jonah for any of this, and then turned and rode east with his 2 men trailing behind him, out of options and unwilling to test whether Jonah was bluffing about the ride back. Chenoa watched them go without a flicker of relief crossing her face. "They will see a white man who took me," she offered quietly, once the riders had shrunk small on the horizon, not thanking him, not quite accusing him either, just naming the shape of the story her own people might reasonably build around this morning. a shape that had nothing to do with what had actually happened, and everything to do with what people expect to be true when they were not there to see it for themselves. Jonah let the words stand without arguing them down. He had learned enough in a life spent watching stories get built the easy way instead of the true way, not to waste breath correcting a fear that was, in its own way, entirely reasonable. They traveled together after that, not quite as strangers anymore, not yet as anything either of them had a word for. She accepted the spare horse on the second day, only after he stopped pressing it and simply left it saddled and waiting each morning, the choice hers alone to make without him watching her make it. She began, almost without meaning to, teaching him things, the names the ridges wore before any surveyor had renamed them, which stands of mesquite hid water underground, how to read a coming storm off the color of the light 2 hours before the first cloud ever showed itself. He cooked a pot of beans one evening that came out scorched at the bottom and thin at the top, an unhappy combination he had not known was possible until he achieved it. Very interesting, she managed, tasting it, her face perfectly composed. Bad? Very. Good. Thought maybe my standards were slipping. And she laughed, one short, surprised sound, gone almost as soon as it arrived, but real. The first unguarded thing he had heard out of her since the trading post. And it did something to the fire between them that no amount of careful gift-leaving ever quite had. She let him in on more, that same evening, about her people, her brother Chenoa, older than her by 4 years, steady where she was quick to judge, the kind of man whose word carried real weight in council, even before he had earned the gray that would eventually show at his temples. She spoke plainly of her family, the way a person speaks of ground they know they still stand on, even after everything that has tried to take it from them. Jonah listened more than he talked, which was, without either of them naming it out loud, becoming the shape of the whole arrangement between them. Her testing the world in small, careful increments, him proving over and over that he could be trusted with the small things before he ever wanted to be trusted with anything larger. The days had a rhythm to them by then, an easy one neither had expected out of a stretch of desert road. Mornings were cool enough for talk, evenings were for the fire and whatever small confession the day had earned. And the long, hot middle of each day belonged mostly to silence and the business of covering ground. Somewhere in that rhythm, the careful quarter-mile gap she had kept between them on that first afternoon had closed down to almost nothing at all, and neither of them had marked the exact moment it happened, only noticed looking back later that it had. It was the third night, with the fire burned down to a red case of coals, that Jonah let out the thing he had been carrying since long before she had ever seen him at that trading post. He had been an army scout years back, good at reading trail sign, good at finding passages through country most men judged impassable, proud in a young man's uncomplicated way of being useful to soldiers who convinced him usefulness was the same thing as being right. One winter he had shown a column of cavalry a mountain passage east of the river, believing, because he had been led to believe it, and because believing it was easier than doubting it, that the soldiers meant to negotiate, to settle something with paper instead of powder. He found out afterward what the passage had actually been used for. Families moved off land that had been theirs for longer than anyone could reasonably count, driven out through a door he himself had opened for the men who did the driving. You brought soldiers. Her voice held no heat in it at all, which was somehow worse than heat would have been. Yes, he put nothing after it, no excuse folded into the confession, no soldiers lied to me, no I was young and didn't understand, none of the things a man reaches for when he wants forgiveness handed to him bundled up neat together with the truth. She rose without another word and walked out past the reach of the firelight, and he let her go, because nothing left unsaid would have sounded like anything but begging. He sat up a long while by the dying coals, turning the whole shape of that winter over in his mind, the way he had turned it over 100 nights before this one, alone, without anyone to weigh it against. He had told the story to exactly no one in 8 years. Not a chaplain, not a friend, not a single soul who might have handed him back some easier version of it to carry instead. Saying it out loud to her, once, had cost him more than the $28 had, and he understood, sitting there with the fire going gray, that he had no way of knowing yet whether it had cost him her as well. He woke at first light to find the spare horse gone and her bedroll empty, and for one long, sick moment he believed she had left for good, walked back into a life that had every right to want nothing further to do with him. Then he saw it, laid deliberate and careful across the folded corner of his own blanket, catching the early sun. A turquoise pendant, worn smooth by years of handling, the kind of thing a woman does not lose by accident and does not leave behind by carelessness. It had been her mother's. She would never have parted with it without meaning something specific by the leaving of it. It was not goodbye, it was a trail, left on purpose, for a man she had apparently decided was worth following after all, provided he was willing to go and find her. He followed the only direction that made sense, west, into a narrow canyon where the walls closed in tight enough to swallow the morning light whole, and found the spare horse first, pulled up lame on a rear leg, favoring it hard with every step. He checked the horse before anything else, ran his hands down the leg, satisfied himself it was a strain and not a break, and only then looked up to find Chenoa on a flat rock 20 feet off, her own ankle wrapped tight in a torn strip of cloth, her face set in the particular stillness of someone determined not to show pain in front of a man she had not yet decided to trust with the sight of it. He left his canteen within her reach and sat down apart from her, the same careful distance he had been keeping since the trading post, and let her know, plainly, where he believed the pendant came from in her family history, her mother, who had died the same winter Jonah had shown soldiers that mountain passage, on a road that may well have been the very one his information had opened. "I am sorry. You want forgiveness?" Something in the question landed sharper than anything she had put to him yet. No. That answer seemed to surprise her more than anything else he could have given. She had expected the same thing every guilty man eventually wanted from her: absolution, wrapped up neat and handed over so he could stop carrying the weight of it. He did not want that from her. He did not excuse the winter either. "I did not know enough." That is not the same thing as not being at fault. He left it there unfinished, without softening it further, and she studied him a long moment before she looked away and began rewrapping her own ankle without his help, refusing it the way she had refused every gift since the day he cut her free. Except that night, when he built the fire, she sat down on his side of it instead of across from it, and neither of them put a single word to what that meant. They stayed in that canyon 2 more days while her ankle mended enough to bear weight, and the lame horse worked the stiffness out of its leg. And in that stretch of borrowed time, the last of the careful distance between them wore away almost entirely. She showed him, without being pressed to, how to read which canyon plants held water in their roots, and which would only poison a thirsty man for the trouble. He showed her, badly, how to skip a flat stone across the shallow pool at the canyon's bend, and missed 4 times before she managed it on her first attempt, and did not bother hiding how pleased that made her. It was, either of them might have admitted later, the closest thing to an ordinary courtship either one of them had ever expected to get, born out of a lame horse and a wrapped ankle, in 2 days neither of them had planned for. They rode on together after that, no longer strangers accompanying each other by circumstance, but something neither of them had a name for yet. And on the second day, riders began appearing along the ridgelines above the trail. 5 at first, then 10, then near 20, mounted and silent and simply watching, making no move to approach and no move to welcome either. "They are deciding what you are," Chenoa let him know quietly, and Jonah understood without needing it explained further that the decision being made up there on the high ground would not be settled by anything he could put into words. It would be settled entirely by what he did. What he did was dismount well short of the camp, before anyone rode down to demand it of him, and unbuckle his gun belt from around his waist and lay it flat across his saddle, in plain sight, before a single word had passed between him and anyone waiting below. A tall, steady-eyed man rode out to meet them first, Chenoa's brother, Chenoa, and his gaze went immediately, unerringly, to the faint mark still visible on his sister's wrists, the fading ghost of rope that had not quite finished healing over. "You touched her." It was not quite a question. "Only to cut the rope," Jonah returned, and put forward nothing further to soften it or explain it away, because nothing further needed saying about it. Beyond Chenoa, the camp opened out along a shallow bend in the river, brush shelters and hide lodges strung in an easy curve that followed the water rather than fighting it, cook fires already going gray-blue with morning smoke, children pausing mid-chase to stare at the stranger, standing hatless and unarmed at the edge of everything they knew. It was, Jonah understood plainly enough, an entire working world he had ridden into, uninvited, full of its own history and its own long memory of exactly what men who looked like him had cost it. He had not expected the smell of wood smoke and river water to feel so much like every other camp he had ever ridden into. He had not expected either how much that similarity would unsettle him. Chenoa could have explained everything in that moment: the trading post, the $28, the food left at careful distances, the water replaced exactly where she had found it, the man who wanted nothing and took nothing and never once used the word grateful in her presence. She let none of it pass her lips. She stood beside her brother in complete silence and let Jonah stand there entirely on his own, because she had already decided, somewhere back on that dusty road, exactly what kind of man he was. What she needed now was for her family to arrive at that same answer without her testimony tipping the scale in his favor. Tom led him, without another word, to an old woman seated outside one of the dwellings, weaving by the light of a small clay lamp, her hair gone entirely silver, her hands never once pausing at their work, even as Jonah crossed the packed earth toward her. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance by then, drawn by the sight of Chenoa leading a stranger through camp, though none of them crowded close enough to interrupt whatever was about to happen at that small fire. Chenoa stood among them, at the edge of the circle, close enough to see and be seen, but making no move to step forward and shape what came next. She looked up only when her eyes caught the faded cavalry insignia still stitched into the leather of his saddle strap, a detail he had stopped noticing years ago because it had simply always been there. A scar on the leather no different to him than a scar on his own hands. Her fingers went still then, for the first time since he had walked up. Through Chenoa, she wanted to know plainly whether he had known, that winter, what the soldiers meant to do with the passage he had shown them. No. Would he have shown them the road at all, had he known? No, and then, before anyone put the question to him, he knelt and laid out everything of value he carried, the last of his money, his bedroll, his revolver on the ground before her. "It isn't enough, but it's everything I have." She did not touch any of it. She reached out instead and touched the faded insignia on the saddle strap, the mark of the very army that had cost her the husband she lost that same hard winter. And she spoke slowly, and Chenoa turned her words into English with the particular care of a man repeating something he did not want carried wrong. A man cannot walk backward over yesterday's trail. He can only choose where his tracks point tomorrow. She pushed his belongings gently back toward him with one hand and returned to her weaving without another word. No ceremony made of it, no forgiveness pronounced out loud for the whole camp to witness. Only that which turned out, somehow, to be enough on its own. Chenoa handed back the gun belt himself and let Jonah know plainly why his sister had stayed silent through all of it. She had already known, since the trading post, exactly what he had done for her. What she needed her family to see for themselves was what he would do when nobody owed him a single word of thanks for any of it. Jonah stayed 3 days at the edge of that camp, useful where he could make himself useful, Careful never to overstay a welcome he understood he had not fully earned by one act at a trading post. And on the morning of the fourth day, he saddled up before first light, meaning to ride east and leave Chenoa to the home and the family that were rightfully hers now that she was safe among them. Staying any longer, he was certain, would start to look less like a decent act freely given and more like a bill quietly presented for payment. And he had not cut that rope wanting to be paid back in any coin at all. She caught him 4 miles out, riding hard enough that her horse was lathered by the time she pulled up alongside him, and she did not slow to make a case for herself first. My family gave me a home. They did not give me my choice. That was the whole of her explanation, and it turned out to be entirely sufficient. She turned her horse to ride beside him rather than behind him, a small thing, a mere placement of horses on an open trail, and also not a small thing at all, toward a life neither one of them could yet fully picture, but that both of them, for the first time since the trading post, seemed willing to ride toward together. She set him one rule before they had gone another mile. Tomorrow do not ask when I am leaving. If I leave, I will let you know. And if I stay, she looked over at him, something almost like humor showing in it now, I will let you know that too. That single rule became the whole shape of the arrangement between them from that morning forward, and neither of them broke it, not once, in all the months that followed. If you're the kind of person who sticks around for stories like this one, become a channel member and tap Join beside the channel name. 3 months later, on a modest spread of land near the river, Jonah had been slowly turning into something that could hold a life. The days had settled into an ordinary rhythm that neither of them had quite dared hope for back on that dusty road outside the trading post. She kept a garden going in soil that had been stubborn ground before she got her hands into it. He kept the corral fences standing straight and the roof mostly from leaking. The seasons turned once across those months, the last of the winter cold giving way to a spring that greened the river bottom faster than either of them had expected. And with it came the small, unremarkable proofs of a life actually being built, rather than merely endured. A second horse broken to the plow, a chicken coop raised in an afternoon with 2 ranch neighbors who had ridden over to help without being asked twice. A shelf Jonah built along one wall for the pieces of pottery she had started collecting from a trader who passed through every few weeks. None of it was much to look at, taken piece by piece. Taken together, it added up to something neither of them had dared name yet, though both of them had started, quietly, living inside it as though the name did not much matter. Somewhere in those 3 months, without either of them marking the exact day it happened, she stopped calling the place Jonah's cabin inside her own head and started calling it simply home. A word she used out loud for the first time one evening while they were fixing a stubborn gate hinge together, and he caught it and let it pass by without remark, because some things are better left to land quietly than pointed at directly and made to feel large. He put the question to her at the corral one evening, near sunset, with no ring ready and no speech prepared, because he had never trusted himself to get a speech right and saw no reason to start trying now. Would you want to keep building this with me? Yes. No hesitation in it at all. The same plain directness she had carried since the day she followed a stranger down a dusty road instead of vanishing alone into the desert. They married 3 months after that in a small wooden chapel that smelled of fresh-cut pine, filled with ranch families from 3 spreads over. The storekeeper who had once counted $28 onto his own counter without knowing what it would come to mean, and Tahoma, who had ridden 2 full days with the rest of Chenoa's family to stand at the front of that little chapel and see the thing through properly, as it deserved to be seen through. Tahoma walked her down the short aisle himself, one hand light at her elbow, but at the front he stepped back and did not place her hand in Jonah's, because that particular choice, everyone gathered in that chapel understood, without a word needing to be spent on it, belonged to her alone and to no one else on this earth, not even the brother who loved her enough to have ridden 2 days to give her away and then chose, at the very last step, not to. The chapel itself held maybe 40 people comfortably, and closer to 60 that afternoon. Folks standing along the back wall and spilling a little into the yard outside, where the doors stood propped open to let in the light. Someone had set jars of prairie flowers along the windowsills. More enthusiasm than arrangement in how they'd been gathered, and a fiddle waited propped against a pew for whenever the ceremony gave way to whatever came after it. The storekeeper had ridden 2 hours to be there and brought, of all things, a jar of good coffee as a wedding gift, which struck more than one person in that chapel as exactly the right kind of gift for how the whole story had started. Harlan, they called him, and he sat near the front with the particular satisfaction of a man who had once counted $28 onto his counter without any idea what it would eventually build. The preacher put the question to her plainly, in front of everyone gathered under that pine-scented roof. Did she come to that altar by her own choosing? She looked once toward Tahoma, who gave her the smallest possible nod, and then she looked at Jonah and gave her answer without a single beat of hesitation. I chose him. She placed her own hand into his, no one guiding it there, no one deciding it for her, just her own hand moving of its own will into his, the way it had been moving toward this exact ending since the morning a stranger turned a knife handle first and cut only the rope and wanted nothing at all in return. The marks on her wrists had faded almost entirely by then, near invisible in the soft chapel light, the kind of scar a person has to know to look for before they can find it at all anymore. What replaced them was plainer to see than any old rope mark could ever have been. A woman standing in a small frontier chapel, having chosen, at every single turn since the day she was freed, exactly the life and exactly the man she wanted, with nobody's hand closing around hers to make that choice on her behalf. That, in the end, was the whole of what Jonah Reed had actually given her outside that trading post months before, though neither of them had understood it as anything more at the time than the simple cutting of a rope. Not rescue exactly, not ownership dressed up under another, gentler name, the way so many kindnesses quietly are. Just the plain return of a choice that had always, rightfully, belonged to her alone. And from that first free step down a dusty road, she went on choosing him, and choosing this, every single day that followed, for the rest of the life they built together near the river, one ordinary morning at a time. Some stories on this channel end in a gunfight. This one ends in a chapel, and it still asks the same question every frontier story asks underneath the dust and the danger. What does a person owe the ones who help them, and what do they owe only themselves? Chenoa's answer took 3 months, a canyon, a grandmother's quiet judgment, and one stubborn man's refusal to ask for anything back. If stories built that patiently are worth your time, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It is the simplest way to keep this kind of story coming. Cottonwood Crossing kept its trading post standing for another 20 years after that spring, and travelers passing through would sometimes hear a version of the story from the storekeeper who liked to tell it. A version that got the $28 right and very little else, the way stories do when they are handed down by people who were only ever standing at the edges of them. The truth, the whole and complicated truth, belonged to exactly 2 people who rode out of that town on the same morning as strangers and rode back into it 3 months later as something else entirely. A woman who had chosen at every turn, and a man who had finally learned the difference between owing a debt and simply choosing to be decent, expecting nothing at all in return for it. Not gratitude, not company, not a future he had any right to ask for. He got one anyway. Some men spend a lifetime trying to earn what Jonah Reed received the moment he turned that knife handle first and cut a single length of rope. Not because he calculated it would be repaid, but because it was, quite simply, the only decent thing to do. And he did it without once looking back to see whether anyone was grateful.